From Chicago's CAN TV, a look at the week's events is reported in the newspapers, in the blogs and online, and on radio and TV. This is Chicago Newsroom.
Hi again, welcome to the show. I'm Ken Davis on this, the day after the big debate. I have a feeling that this is going to work its way into the political lexicon. Denver, October 3rd, that we'll be talking about, oh yeah, that was Obama before Denver, or that was Romney post Denver, or something like that. And you know, I don't make predictions, I'm not very good at it, but what I will say is on January 20th, when you're pulling yourself up to your screen to watch President Romney's inaugural, and you're saying to yourself, how did this happen? It seemed like Obama was really doing well. This would be the day that the wheels came off, or last night was, but maybe not. We'll see. We'll see what happens. There's still a lot of time to go, but it was a very interesting thing to sit and watch last night. One of the things that we're going to be talking about today with Kari Lydersen, who's joining us, and Kari, great to have you on Chicago Newsroom. Thanks for being here. Kari is a multifaceted, multi-talented writer and author of 3 books. She's writing for In These Times, Midwest Energy News, and has written for just about every paper in the United States in her various travels around the country. Generally calls Chicago home, and I'm glad that you do. And I'm just really excited about having you here today. And we decided we wanted to be a little bit jealous and just dominate your time and have you here for the whole half hour. So that's what we're doing here today. So we really have to start talking a little bit about last night. I'm just imagining that you're like on the phone with a good long-term friend of yours and talking about it. What are you saying?
Well, I was on the phone with my mom, and she couldn't stand. She called me every like 5 minutes to to keep complaining about Romney, and so I had the sound off actually for part of it because I was talking to her, and that made it even more interesting.
Yeah. But interestingly enough, though, I think even if you were watching that thing with the sound off, you could still see that the president was being dominated. I mean, he was looking down. He wasn't making eye contact. He seemed to be cowed almost by.
It was weird, and you know, my impression, at least at one point, and I jumped in the middle, and you know, so this was early on in my watching it, was that he just was. It appeared to me that he was just annoyed and frustrated with having to sit there and, you know, and listen to this. And I got his sort of body language as, you know, kind of sarcastic and just sick of it all. But obviously, who knows if I'm right? And even so, you know, obviously that didn't come across as what'll help him.
But I mean, that's his job. His job was to show up for this thing and be like raring to go. And yeah, I'm going to take you I'm going to take you down one point after another. And it just, I think it was Chris Matthews who said he didn't show up, and it's kind of like. Anyway, we're not going to resolve this one today, and there are plenty of other pundits who are out there tweeting their little butts off today, giving their 140 characters about what went wrong last night. So we'll let them have that. I did want to start with a piece of sort of breaking news as of last night. 79.1% of Chicago's teachers, of the 20,000 who voted, over 16,000 voted aye in favor of accepting the contract. So I'm wondering how you feel, as somebody who's written as extensively as you have about labor and labor unions. Would you put this in the category of an unmitigated victory for the Chicago Teachers Union? I mean, they came up against all odds. They had unanimous votes of their House of Delegates. They went out with 90% strike vote, and now they have gone back in with an 80% vote. That looks pretty tidy to me.
Seems like a huge victory to me, and you know, probably nothing is ever an unmitigated victory, but I thought it was a gigantic victory. And you know, and like you said, there were sort of ongoing various stages to the victory. And you know, I think one of the things was that whole refusal to rush into calling off the strike on that Sunday, and you know, to take the extra time to make sure that the membership was on board with the contract. And you know, that's part of the reason I'm sure that they got such an overwhelming ratification. So you know, even just that's not little, but you know, even various steps along the way that led to this outcome, I think it was really, you know, kind of a cascading series of victories for the teachers, and you know, to a degree for the sort of labor in the city as a whole.
Yeah, I think we've had some conversation on the show about what it was like in the back room there after the House of Delegates vote, and and that there was a very strong feeling that this is a democratic union and that we need to take the extra time to bring all of the individual teachers online and all that. So in at least those regards, I think it's fair to say that it was managed as a strike. It was managed very well. So there's been a sort of a rush to jump to the bigger picture and say, well, this was something of a victory for the CTU, and it is therefore a victory for organized labor. And I think you're as good an observer as anybody I know about this. Can you sort of tamp that down for us, or do you think it is also?
Well, I think it's, you know, like anything, not one struggle, not one strike is going to change the whole landscape. And I mean, you know, sort of a good example is I wrote and reported a lot on the window factory occupation 4 years ago. And, you know, there was a lot of kind of euphoria at the time. Yeah, on Goose Island. And there was a lot of sort of euphoria and, you know, this kind of feeling that everything would be different and there'd be factory occupations all over the country. And, you know, and that didn't happen. And then it was a rough road for the workers who, you know, it eventually, after a long, long road, became, you know, I think a success story. And it sounds like they formed a company and, you know, it'll probably be a continuing success story, but it definitely wasn't an overnight change. And, you know, I'm sure it'll be the same with the teachers union. I mean, I think it was, it will have really lasting impact, both in terms of just showing that a union can get what they want to a large degree by being bold and, you know, by risking alienating some people and by standing up for, you know, for their rights. And it also focused a lot of attention on the school reform debate, you know, which I'm sure will be a positive thing in the long run for teachers unions all over the country. But I mean, obviously it's not going to change, you know, that alone is not going to change labor in the US or in Chicago. And, you know, in some ways it might make it harder for some other unions too, because of the way it, there has been, you know, all this vitriol and, you know, probably some segment of the population, it's probably a small segment, but, you know, some people may feel more negative about labor than they did before. I mean, the mayor probably does.
Yeah, yeah. So. Well, we were observing here that, you know, just because the teachers were excited about all those police vehicles and fire engines and trucks that were rolling by with their horns blaring, didn't necessarily mean that anything big was happening. It just meant, hey, we're next, and we want to, you know, we want to express our solidarity, or maybe just thanks for getting the ball rolling or something. But I mean, there is a brutal negotiation coming up between the police and fire and the mayor, and who knows where that's going to head.
And that's interesting, being the unions that, I mean, you would think that teachers unions, you know, would be unions that administrators wouldn't want to alienate and wouldn't want to cast as the bad guys, but for some reason they have, from Chris Christie to Arnold Schwarzenegger to Rahm Emanuel. But firefighters and police, you know, is a whole nother story. I mean, I think it'll be really interesting to see if the administration, I mean, they've already been, you know, fairly combative, but to what lengths they'll go, you know, to fight publicly with police and firefighters who, you know, a lot of people see even more than teachers as sort of heroes that you're not supposed to mess with.
Right. So. Well, I mean, interesting to talk about not supposed to mess with. You're probably familiar with Bruce Rauner, right? He's Mayor Emanuel's close friend and advisor, a very wealthy man, and has funded a lot of, I think it's fair to say, anti-union activities. It was a remarkable interview with Carol Maureen on Chicago Tonight, in which he said, let's recognize the CTU for what it is, plain and simple. It's about the strike. Let's recognize the strike for what it is. It's about the union's drive to protect Chicago's incompetent teachers at the expense of teachers and students and good teachers. It's about protecting political power. And he went on to say, this is a war, and it's a war with huge stakes, and the taxpayers and parents have got to win. He says, I'm an advocate and aggressive supporter for teachers. He's worked for teachers and so forth, but that teachers' unions must be stripped away from the teachers so that they can get away from this corrupting influence of unions. And then went on to talk about how they all have these filthy rich pensions and so forth. I mean, I find it admirable in a weird way that he's willing to at least be public about it. I mean, the guy went on TV and said these things on TV and spoke the day before quite eloquently about his view that unions are the problem and pensions are the problem. These tend to be the people who, it appears from what we know, have the ear of our mayor.
Yeah, you know, and that quote, I mean, and you have a good point that at least because there's a lot of, you know, sort of veiled objectives and, you know, unspoken things going on in the school reform fight nationwide. So I guess, you know, there is something to be said for him being open about his opinions, but that quote just really, you know, makes my blood pressure rise on all different levels. And I mean, having a lot of friends who are teachers and working with youth in the classrooms in the Chicago public schools where, you know, I'm doing these journalism programs, so I'm not employed by the schools, and, you know, I don't have to be accountable to any sort of metrics or results or anything, but I get, you know, a little bit of a window into what the teachers are dealing with. And it just, you know, the nerve of someone who's not themselves a teacher, and I know, you know, he does have experience with teachers, you know, from his side of the fence, but there's no doubt these teachers are hardworking, and, you know, I mean, sure, there's probably some incompetent ones, but to paint all the Chicago teachers with a broad brush that they're incompetent without, you know, and they're the ones that have been talking so much about wanting to have a vibrant debate about meaningful evaluation, and, you know, and then also, I mean, when you talk about charter schools, I think there are some wonderful charter schools out there, but, you know, part of what makes charter schools good is the smaller class sizes and the extra flexibility that the teachers have. So why don't you find a way to give that to the public school teachers? It seems really obvious.
Oh, it also just happens that there are some incredibly wonderful public schools too.
Right,
by the way.
Exactly. Yeah.
In fact, better than the best charter schools, but you know, we've beaten this horse in the past here. I don't know that there's anything more we can add to this, other than that something happened here. A labor union. This was a battle that needed to happen. This was a public fight that needed to be engaged, and there were very few people, very few organizations, very few entities left with the power to have that, to bring that battle to the public view the way the CTU did. And in my opinion, and it's not necessarily a pro-CTU statement even to say this, the benefit that we all received as Chicagoans was that there was one strong union standing that was still able to organize itself to say, wait a minute, before you go any further down this path, there are things we need to talk about. There are things we need to put on the table. And they did. And that strikes me as an unqualified good thing, as a public service.
Well, and the whole idea of, you know, this being about politics and about power, like on one level, of course it is. And I think that's another thing that really upset me sort of about this whole debate and the way that the administration was attacking the teachers union and, you know, saying it was a strike of choice and that they shouldn't be striking. I mean, it's a really lopsided analysis of, you know, power and political structures that exist for a reason and have been, you know, kind of mutually accepted and acknowledged over many years.
Right,
and I mean, you know, no one questions the mayor's power to, you know, to issue executive orders or to, you know, consult with who he wants to consult with. And, you know, that's his right, whether you like what he does or not. And, you know, the unions, including the teachers union, have a right to strike and do other things that, you know, are protected by labor law. So to disrespect that right, I think, is, you know, it's okay for unions to be political and to want power. I mean, that's part of what they're set up to do.
Yeah,
so.
yeah. Well, as long as I'm raising your blood pressure by reading things to you, let me read you something else. This is from the official transcript from last night. This is possible future President Romney speaking to President Obama, who had just talked about his energy policy. Romney said, "Mr. President, all of the increase in natural gas and oil that we've been benefiting from here in the United States has happened on private land, not on government land. On government land, your administration has cut the number of permits and licenses in half. If I'm president, I'll double them," he said, "and I'll also get the oil from offshore and the oil from Alaska, and I'll bring that pipeline in from Canada. And by the way, I like coal. I'm going to make sure we can continue to burn clean coal. People in the coal industry feel like it's getting crushed by your policies, and I want to get America and North America independent so we can create jobs. You've written about this a lot. You've written about it as much as anybody. Have you ever seen a piece of clean coal? Does clean coal exist?
I mean, the whole, phrase, it depends how you define clean. I mean, the coal can be burned to produce power much more cleanly than it could in the past. The pollutants that harm public health have been greatly reduced. So in that sense, it is a lot cleaner. They still haven't really figured out how to capture and sequester the carbon dioxide. So in terms of, and that doesn't harm the people that live around a plant, but obviously contributes to climate change. So in that sense, it's not clean. And then, what the environmental groups bring up is the mining is, even with the best technology, coal mining is just by its nature, a really invasive process that,
just the process of
whether
lopping
it's
tops off of mountains or whatever it is.
Yeah. So, and I mean, the Powder River Basin, where most of our coal comes from in the U.S. and Wyoming, is, I mean, I guess you could take the attitude that we just write off these certain pieces of the country because they provide our, our energy and our resources. But, and then it's also just interesting talking about increasing coal and gas exploitation, and then this whole sort of idea of energy security that he's alluding to too, that we need to tap the coal and the gas that we have here as if that somehow makes us safer and, gives us cheaper or better energy. All these things are world markets. I mean, natural gas is sold and the price is set domestically.
As is oil?
Well, yeah. Well, I mean, there is actually a difference since the oil prices are, are set internationally and the gas prices are set domestically. But one thing I've just been reporting on a lot with coal is the international markets and how, because of all these plants closing, the coal companies, the mining companies, are really looking to ramp up their exports to China and possibly also to Europe. So, they obviously don't care whether they're U.S. companies or foreign-owned companies. They don't care where the coal goes as long as they get the money.
Or where the hydrocarbons get put into the air.
Right. Yeah.
Just so long as it gets burned. That's interesting because, as you mentioned, here in Chicago, 3 of the biggest plants, or the plants in Chicago, Fisk and Crawford and State Line. You wrote about them. You've been writing about them for years and years and years, and there have been all kinds of efforts to either legally or embarrass them into closing because of how filthy these plants were. And they did. They all closed, and they all closed very recently. But it's at least been my observation that they didn't close because they woke up one morning and said, "Oh my God, these plants are polluting the air. Let's shut them off." They did it because it just became too expensive to operate them. I mean, by comparison, you can start out of the ground a gas plant using fracked gas that will operate for a fraction of what an installed 100-year-old coal plant runs for. So, shut them off.
Yeah, and it's a mix of factors because the federal environmental regulations that have been coming down the pipeline and that are kicking in, I mean, they would make it more expensive for a lot of these old plants to operate because they would need to install new pollution controls. And if natural gas, if fracking hadn't come on the scene, chances are those companies would be willing to install those pollution controls. But now the combination of the the cheap gas, largely made available by fracking, and then the pollution controls together is causing all these coal plants to close.
It's such a that whole issue in and of itself is just so incredibly interesting because out of almost nowhere you have this new process of getting excuse me, I'm sorry, I don't know what's in here, but man, out of from almost nowhere to ramped up this quickly, you have this ability to get down thousands of feet and extract gas from God knows where, using this hydraulic fracturing method, which is, let's just say, controversial. And at the moment, gas, as I understand it, is at its lowest ever. I mean, it's just the cheapest per therm that it's ever been. And so that means that it is, as we said, very easy to create new plants that will burn this stuff, and it has, even though the economy is as messed up as it is, we've all been benefiting from really cheap gas. We may not be thinking about that, but it cost almost nothing to heat our homes last year compared to years before. That probably won't last, but what it's doing is it's skewing electric generation in a really weird way. And as you say, what's interesting about it to me is that it might be taking these old plants offline, but I don't know, the benefit might not be what it looks like.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's definitely true. And, you know, there's just so many interesting things with all there's obviously no perfect or clean solution to getting energy. And I mean, with the gas, you know, and one thing, I think there's a lot of reasons to be concerned about fracking, but one thing that kind of has struck me about the fracking debate is that I feel like it's almost distracted attention from, you know, also how destructive coal mining is and oil extraction. And, you know, if you talk about electric cars, you need more electricity, so you might be getting off oil, and then there's more, you know, but that is elevating even more
you still need to
demand for
juice.
Electricity that might be powered by gas. So, and then just, you know, sort of another interesting thing on the whole world market question is there's also a big push to export. I mean, a few, 10 or so years ago, we were talking about importing liquefied natural gas and building these terminals to do that. And now it's the opposite. These same players are wanting to export liquefied natural gas. And then if they do that, you know, will that make domestic gas prices go up? It probably will. So will that make coal again more attractive? I mean, there's so many moving pieces, and I don't think even, you know, the top industry analysts really know what's going to happen. So, you know, there's a lot of gambling going on, and, you know, a lot of the clean coal stuff, I think a lot of these projects, you know, the developers may not even actually want to build them, but they're just sort of trying to hedge all their bets and, you know, get the permits and get the different things in place so they can wait and see how the market develops and be ready
I sat in on a really interesting policy discussion about the coal gasification plant that was proposed for the south side of Chicago, this huge thing that would basically take in rail cars full of coal and then process it and make natural gas out of it. And one of the things that their economist was saying is that this suppressed low price of natural gas that we're seeing right now is an aberration. And as you point out, as soon as the gas companies figure out ways to export the physical product out of here in LNG tankers and so forth, then that price will go up. And at some point, it's going to get to the point that it's going to be cheaper to gasify coal than it is to extract it out of the ground using fracking. And this is all part of what we have to deal with in this energy mix.
Yeah, and you know, one thing, and I think it's debatable, to say the least, whether the coal gasification would ever be more affordable than just using natural gas. I mean, obviously the developers who want to do that plant say it is, but the other big piece of that I feel like, you know, didn't get quite enough attention in the Chicago debate was that that's all contingent on building this pipeline to carry the carbon dioxide to the Gulf Coast.
New Orleans, right?
Yeah, which isn't built yet. I mean, there's, again, just so many moving pieces. You know.
Well, I mean, that's what was so weird about that is that, as you point out, it's not just, you know, okay, so this plant doesn't have a smokestack. It's not going to be putting, you know, the same kind of smoke and carbons into the air that a coal-fired plant, electric plant would have, but it's still creating the same amount of carbon dioxide. So the proposal was literally to build a pipe all the way to the Gulf and then somehow or other stash it in the ground down around New Orleans somewhere for what is supposed to be ever, right?
Yeah. Well, and then also what they're actually, I mean, I think, you know, the long-term plan is to sequester it forever, but what they do most immediately and what is key to the economics of their whole project is selling the carbon dioxide for enhanced oil recovery. So you're using it to get more oil out of the ground. So then do you figure in the carbon from that oil? You know, there's no, I mean.
But, you know, this is the point where I think the energy people and conservatives, I think this is where they will say, okay, so what do you want to do? We have to have this energy. We have ever increasing demand for energy, and you're not going to sit there and tell me, little lady, that you can put a couple of PVC panels up on top of your roof and that's going to solve the problem, because it ain't. So what do you do?
Yeah, well, that's interesting. I was just in Germany and the UK doing this energy reporting, and in Germany they're saying, they're trying to make themselves the test case, at least the Green Party and the sort of pro renewable energy people there are trying to make the country the test case to prove that you can be 100%, or at least what the government's committed to is 80% powered by renewables. And I think most experts say that's not possible, but there's at least some, I guess, that say it is possible. And I think one of the, I know, one of the key things to make that even remotely doable is totally overhauling the grid and, instituting smart grids and centrally planning, a complete overhaul and improvement of the national grid. And
in fact, start talking about a global grid.
Yeah.
Really,
so it's a massive undertaking. And obviously for the near or even the not so near future, fossil fuels are realistically going to have to be part of the equation. So
what disappoints me about the whole energy debate, though, is that we too quickly retreat to that place of it's too big, the problem's too big, we've got to just keep drill, baby, drill. Instead of saying, no, it's really not. This is a soluble problem, and we really have to, this is a good place, this is a good role for government, Mr. Romney, to be, anyway.
Yeah.
So, yeah. I'm just realizing we've got about a minute left here, and I don't even know where to go because we have so many other things that we could have talked about. But I want to go back to something. You talked about the thing about Goose Island. We got just about a minute or so. What is the status on that? You've been following that, right? The revolt on Goose Island and the window manufacturers and so forth. That plant doesn't exist anymore, right?
Well, the Sirius Energy, the one that they had, the California company bought it, and so anyway, that place closed. People probably heard they occupied the plant and got a little more time to find an investor, and the workers formed a worker-owned company. So they're just, now in the process of getting that worker-owned company off the ground. And this goes back to the green jobs, and I mean, it hasn't, it didn't work with Sirius Energy, but maybe this is another opportunity to, and this is again where government, whether it's local or federal, could maybe give these sorts of things a boost.
There might be a role for government, but after all, the private sector can handle all these things. Kari, thank you so much. It's just a pleasure having you on the show. Hope you come back again sometime when you're around town. All right?
Thank you.
Thanks so much. Kari Lydersen joining us here on the old Chicago Newsroom today, and that's what you've been watching in Chicago Newsroom. It's a community service of CAN TV. I'm Ken Davis, and of course you can find us here on cable, but you can also see us online any old time you want if you just go to the address that is appearing right now on your screen, and I hope that you'll do that. You can also get us on iTunes too. You can do it as a podcast. So we'll be back next week with another program, and we hope you'll be watching us. Thanks so much, and we will see you next time here on Chicago Newsroom.